The phone rang just as I was sitting in the crowded doctor's waiting room, the sterile scent of disinfectant hanging in the air. I glanced at the screen. It was my daughter, Melissa, my only child. For a moment, my heart lifted. Since my husband Thomas had passed away 6 months earlier, Melissa had been the one constant in my life, the one person who visited often enough to keep me from drowning in grief. I thought she was calling to check on me, maybe to ask how I was feeling, or to tell me she'd drop by later. But the moment I answered, I realized something was terribly wrong. Her voice wasn't warm, wasn't loving. It was cold, almost businesslike. "Mom," she said flatly, "we're leaving tomorrow. Richard and I are flying to Europe. I already sold the beach house and the truck. We needed the money. Don't worry, you'll be fine. Bye." Click. Just like that, the line went dead. No explanation, no discussion, no chance for me to object. The green plastic chair beneath me suddenly felt harder than stone. My pulse hammered in my ears as the words sank in. The beach house. The truck. Gone. 45 years of memories with Thomas swept away with a 2-minute phone call. Summers spent grilling on the porch, birthdays celebrated by the ocean, Christmases with the fire crackling and Melissa opening her presents under the tree, all of it reduced to a bank transaction she didn't even bother to explain. And the truck, Thomas's pride and joy. He had cared for that old Ford pickup like it was a member of the family. He washed it every Sunday, changed the oil religiously, and parked it under the same oak tree out front. Even after his death, his scent lingered on the worn leather seats. It was the last piece of him I had left. And now, according to Melissa, it was gone too. I should have cried. I should have broken down in that waiting room filled with strangers. But instead, something unexpected happened. A strange calm spread through me. A calm I hadn't felt since the morning Thomas died at the breakfast table, coffee cup in his hand. Because in that moment, with Melissa's words still echoing in my ears, I remembered something Thomas had given me 3 days before his heart gave out. A manila envelope. His eyes had been serious, his voice steady as he said, "Evelyn, put this away in your dresser. Don't open it yet. Only when you're ready." Until that phone call, I had forgotten it existed. My grief had buried it beneath endless funeral arrangements and sleepless nights. But now I knew it was waiting for me. And suddenly, for the first time in months, I almost smiled. Melissa thought she had discarded me like yesterday's trash. But Thomas had always been a man who planned ahead. And I had the unsettling feeling that inside that envelope was the answer to everything Melissa believed she had taken from me. After Thomas's death, the days blurred together like ink spreading on wet paper. 6 months had passed, but in my mind, it still felt like yesterday. The sound of his chair scraping against the kitchen floor, the smell of his morning coffee, the way he leaned over, kissed my forehead and whispered, "Good morning, my love," as though it were a sacred ritual. That was the last thing he ever said before his heart betrayed him, and he slumped forward, leaving me alone with a life that suddenly felt too big, too empty. Melissa came into my life more often then. At first, I thought it was kindness. She drove me to the grocery store, held my elbow as we walked through the aisles, and insisted I sit down while she pushed the cart. "Mom, you don't need to strain yourself. Let me do it," she'd say, flashing that smile I had always thought was love. She helped with the funeral arrangements, sitting beside me in the funeral home while we discussed caskets and flower arrangements, nodding solemnly as if she were sharing in my grief. 3 times a week, without fail, she showed up at my door, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with a casserole, sometimes with a bouquet of flowers she claimed Richard had picked out. "We're worried about you," she would say. "You need to take care of yourself now that Dad's gone." At the time, I believed her. I wanted to believe her. I was so raw, so desperate for comfort, that I clung to any sign that my daughter still cared. But looking back, I can see it differently now. Her visits weren't about love. They were reconnaissance missions. She was testing the waters, preparing for the moment when she and Richard could make their move. It was subtle at first. She'd sit at my kitchen table, flipping through the pile of bills or doctor's notes I left lying around. "You should really see a doctor for a general checkup," she said once, tapping the papers with her manicured finger. "Mom, you need to take better care of yourself now. I can make the appointment for you." And I nodded, grateful, not realizing she was already laying the foundation for the power of attorney she'd later shove under my nose in a blur of grief and confusion. She had a way of masking her intentions with that bright smile, the same smile I'd loved since she was a little girl with pigtails and scraped knees. But the truth was hiding in her eyes, in that quick darting glance toward the china cabinet filled with heirlooms, or the way she lingered in front of framed photos of the beach house. I thought she was reminiscing. Now I know she was calculating. The beach house, it wasn't just property. It was a piece of our souls. Thomas and I bought it when Melissa was 15, after years of scraping together savings from his bus driving routes and my part-time bookkeeping. It was small, painted cream with a wraparound porch that looked out over the ocean. But to us, it was paradise. Every summer, we packed the truck and drove down, staying for weeks at a time. Thomas grilled fish while I tossed salads in the kitchen, and Melissa ran barefoot through the sand, shrieking with laughter. Later, she brought her friends, then boyfriends, and eventually Richard. I cooked for them all, washed their sandy towels, and smiled, because that was what mothers did. The beach house was more than a vacation spot. It was the heart of our family. I never imagined my daughter would see it only as dollar signs. And the truck, Thomas's old Ford pickup. To most people, it was just a vehicle, worn and dented with age, but to him, it was a symbol of pride. He polished the chrome until it gleamed, kept the engine running like new, and parked it under the oak tree where it caught the afternoon light. After he died, I'd sometimes sit in the driver's seat, breathing in the faint scent of his aftershave and the coffee he spilled once on a long drive. It was the last physical link I had to him. Melissa knew that. She knew, and she sold it anyway. Her visits grew more insistent as weeks passed. She wanted me to downsize, to move into a smaller apartment closer to her and Richard. "It'll be easier for everyone, Mom," she insisted, sipping tea in my kitchen as if she owned the place. "You don't need all the space, you don't need the truck, and the beach house, it's just extra stress." I resisted at first. My heart clung to the walls, the furniture, the ghosts of a life I wasn't ready to let go of. But grief makes you weak. You start doubting yourself, wondering if maybe the people you love are right. Maybe you are a burden. Maybe you should let go. I signed papers I didn't understand, trusting her, because she was my daughter. Because she smiled and touched my hand and said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of everything." And I believed her. When the phone call came in the doctor's waiting room, I realized the truth. All those visits, all those smiles, all that help, it had been rehearsed, calculated, a performance to soften me for betrayal. But even as I sat there, surrounded by strangers, coughing into tissues and flipping through outdated magazines, I didn't break. I didn't scream. I didn't let them see my heart splinter. Instead, I thought of Thomas, of the manila envelope tucked away in my dresser drawer, sealed with his handwriting. "Only when you feel ready," he had said. Melissa believed she had stripped me of everything that mattered. She believed she had finally turned me into the helpless widow she had been preparing to control. But she was wrong. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't broken. And I had a secret that was about to change everything. The nurse finally called my name, but even as she led me down the narrow hallway toward the doctor's office, my mind wasn't on my blood pressure or cholesterol. It was on the envelope. That manila envelope Thomas had handed me 3 days before his heart gave out. I could almost hear his voice again, calm and steady, the way it always was when life seemed too heavy for me. "Evelyn, put this in the drawer of your dresser. Don't open it until you're ready." Ready. At the time, I hadn't questioned him. Thomas wasn't a man of secrets. He was simple, hardworking, loyal. If he wanted me to wait, then I waited. But grief has a way of clouding everything. After the funeral, the casseroles from neighbors, the endless paperwork, I shoved that envelope to the back of the drawer and let it fade from memory, until Melissa's phone call snapped me awake. In the doctor's office, I sat quietly while he listened to my heart and peered at my chart. "You're in good health for your age, Mrs. Carter," he said with a practiced smile. "You need more rest, a balanced diet, and maybe a hobby to keep your mind active. But overall, you're doing well." I nodded, but the words rolled off me like water off glass. My mind was already back in my bedroom, staring at the dresser drawer. The doctor's voice grew faint, like distant static. When he finished, I thanked him and walked slowly through the hallway, past the waiting room where I'd received Melissa's call. I no longer felt like a victim sitting in that green plastic chair. I felt like a woman with a mission. At the bus stop, the late afternoon sun painted the city in gold. People hurried past, clutching briefcases, coffee cups, or children's hands. Everyone had their own tragedies hidden beneath their coats, their own secrets gnawing at them. I had mine too, and soon I would uncover them. When I arrived home, I didn't even take off my shoes. I went straight to the bedroom, opened the dresser, and pulled out the envelope. It was heavier than I remembered. My hands trembled as I turned it over, tracing the neat handwriting. Evelyn. For a long moment, I sat on the edge of the bed, the fading light casting shadows across the room. This had been our room, Thomas's and mine, filled with laughter, whispered conversations, and the comfort of familiarity. Now it felt like a vault holding one last secret he had left for me. Finally, I slid my finger under the flap and opened it. Inside were stacks of documents. Property deeds, bank certificates, company shares, and on top, a handwritten letter. I unfolded it carefully, as though the paper itself might break under my touch. "My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer by your side. I am sorry for leaving you with grief, but I hope what I've left here will give you strength. Over the years, I invested our savings in ways I never told you. We do not just own the beach house. We own 6 other properties, an apartment building, and shares in several companies. You are richer than you ever imagined, Evelyn. You are the sole heir to all of it." My breath caught. For a moment, I thought I was misreading the words. Thomas, my Thomas, who had driven buses for 40 years, who'd clipped coupons with me at the kitchen table, had quietly built an empire behind the scenes. I read on, tears blurring the ink. "I never told you because I wanted our daughter to love us for who we are, not what we own. I feared if Melissa knew, she would change. I hope I was wrong, but I suspect I wasn't. That is why I kept it a secret. If she ever hurts you, if she ever forgets what matters, this envelope will remind you of your worth, not in money, but in dignity. You are not helpless, Evelyn. You never were." I pressed the letter to my chest, sobbing quietly into the silence of our bedroom. For months I had felt stripped bare, discarded, like an old coat no one wanted. But now, with Thomas's words in my hands, I felt something bloom inside me again. Resolve. Melissa thought she had left me with nothing. She thought she had taken my last treasures. But Thomas had planned for this. He had left me not only wealth, but also a plan. The next morning, I woke with clarity. I made myself strong coffee, buttered toast, just the way Thomas liked, and sat at the kitchen table with the envelope spread before me. As the sun streamed through the curtains, I studied the deeds and certificates. There were properties scattered across the city, 2 houses in quiet neighborhoods, a small motel on the coast, and even a 20-story apartment building downtown. And all of it in my name. For the first time in months, I laughed. A dry, almost bitter laugh, but laughter nonetheless. Melissa had sold the beach house and the truck, believing she had taken the last pieces of my life. She had no idea she had stolen pennies while I still held the treasure chest. Later that day, I walked to Margaret Lewis's house, my neighbor and friend of 40 years. She greeted me at the door with a casserole dish and sympathetic eyes. "Evelyn, you look different today," she said, tilting her head. "Stronger." I forced a smile. Maybe I finally slept well. But of course, I didn't tell her the truth. Not yet. The secret was too precious, too dangerous. Instead, I returned home and dialed a number Thomas had written at the bottom of his letter. "If you ever need guidance, call Jonathan Miller. He knows everything." When the lawyer answered, his voice was warm, professional. "Mrs. Carter, I was expecting this call someday. I've been holding certain files for Thomas. Why don't you come into my office tomorrow morning?" Tomorrow. I hung up the phone, my heart racing. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt purpose thrumming through my veins. The grief was still there, heavy and sharp, but now it had company, determination. Melissa and Richard thought they had discarded me, but they were about to learn that the woman they believed was weak, broken, and helpless was far stronger than they ever imagined, and I couldn't wait for the day they discovered the truth. The following morning, I dressed more carefully than I had in months, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to remind myself who I was. I pulled my wine-colored dress from the back of the closet, the one Thomas always said made me look elegant, as though I belonged in a theater lobby or a fine restaurant. I brushed my graying hair into a neat bun, dabbed on a little rouge, and for the first time in half a year, looked in the mirror without flinching. "This is who you are, Evelyn," I whispered to my reflection. "Not a broken widow, not a discarded mother, a woman with her own power." Jonathan Miller's office was in a tall, old building downtown, the kind with marble floors, brass railings, and wide windows that overlooked the bustling streets below. When I arrived, the receptionist smiled politely and asked me to wait. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, the kind of smell that carried both authority and history. When Jonathan appeared, he was exactly the kind of man Thomas would have trusted. Calm eyes behind rimless glasses, a steady handshake, and a voice that carried both warmth and gravity. "Mrs. Carter," he said, guiding me into his office. "I'm glad you called. Thomas told me you might one day." His office was lined with shelves heavy with legal books, framed diplomas, and a single photograph of him with Thomas at some community event. I couldn't help but stare. "You knew my husband well?" Jonathan nodded. "He came to me almost 15 years ago. At first, it was about a small investment, some property he wanted to buy. But then he returned, again and again. Over time, I became not just his attorney, but a friend. And I promised him that when the time came, I would take care of you." I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, clutching the manila envelope in my lap like a life preserver. My voice trembled as I spoke. "I had no idea, Mr. Miller. He never told me anything. All those years I thought we were scraping by, that every penny mattered. I clipped coupons, I worried about bills, and all the while, he was planning ahead," Jonathan finished gently. "He wanted to protect you, Evelyn. He knew Melissa. He worried about what money might do to her. He wanted her to love him and you for who you were, not for what you owned. That's why he kept it hidden." Tears threatened to blur my vision, but I blinked them back. "And now, what do I do now?" Jonathan leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "First, we establish your legal authority. Every deed, every share, every account, your name is on them. But there are administrative steps we must take to solidify your control. We will re-register certain properties, secure the bank certificates, and, most importantly, ensure no one else can touch what is rightfully yours." My heart pounded. "Melissa, she already sold the beach house and the truck. Can I get them back?" His expression tightened. "Yes, the truck may be more complicated, depending on how she sold it. But the beach house, that was fraudulent. She had no right to sell it without your consent. We can have the sale annulled. It may take time, but it is entirely possible." For the first time, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "And Melissa? Will she face legal consequences?" "That depends on you," Jonathan replied carefully. "If you wish, we can pursue charges. But if you prefer discretion, there are quieter paths. Thomas once told me you had a forgiving heart. He asked me, should this day ever come, to remind you of that." The room fell silent for a moment, save for the ticking of the brass clock on his bookshelf. My mind swirled with images. Melissa at 5 years old, giggling on Thomas's lap. Melissa at 15, sulking at the beach house but still secretly happy. Melissa last week, her voice like ice as she told me she'd sold everything. I don't want her in prison, I said finally. But I don't want her to think she's won either. I want her to learn. Jonathan studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Then we proceed discreetly. Quietly undo what she's done, secure what's yours, and keep her in the dark until the time is right. A slow smile spread across my face. Yes, that's exactly what I want. For the next 2 hours, Jonathan walked me through the details. Property deeds tucked into shell companies Thomas had created years ago. Accounts spread across multiple banks, each carefully designed to look ordinary, invisible to a greedy eye. Shares in businesses I had never even heard of. Each page felt like peeling back another layer of the man I had loved for nearly half a century. A man who had been far more than I ever realized. When I left his office, the city looked different. The honking cars, the neon signs, the vendors shouting on the sidewalks. All of it felt sharper, more vivid, as though the world had shifted slightly on its axis. I wasn't just Evelyn Carter, widow, discarded mother. I was Evelyn Carter, the rightful owner of properties, businesses, and accounts that Melissa couldn't even dream of. On the bus ride home, I gazed out the window, watching the streets blur into one another. Somewhere in Europe, Melissa and Richard were probably sipping champagne, laughing about how clever they'd been. I almost pitied them. Almost. When I arrived home, Margaret Lewis was trimming her rose bushes. She waved, her kind eyes searching my face. "Evelyn, you've got a new light in your step," she said. I smiled faintly. Maybe I finally remembered who I am. She tilted her head, curious, but didn't press. That was the kind of friend Margaret was. She knew when to push and when to simply let you hold your secrets. Inside, I set the envelope back in the dresser, but this time I didn't shove it to the back. I left it right at the front, where I could see it every morning. A reminder. Melissa thought she had buried me in grief. But what she didn't know was that her betrayal had done the opposite. It had woken me up. And with Jonathan Miller at my side, I was ready to fight, not with rage or revenge, but with patience, precision, and the quiet strength Thomas had always seen in me. This was no longer just survival. This was the beginning of my plan. While Evelyn Carter sat across from Jonathan Miller, signing papers with trembling but determined hands, her daughter Melissa was stepping off a plane in Paris. She clutched Richard's arm as though the foreign city itself might swallow her whole. He, on the other hand, walked with the swagger of a man who believed he had pulled off the perfect trick. "Europe, babe," Richard said, his voice brimming with self-importance. "This is the start of something big. You'll see." Melissa forced a smile, but even she couldn't silence the gnawing unease in her stomach. They had liquidated her mother's most precious possessions, and the money was already dwindling, spent on first-class tickets, fancy hotels, and Richard's ever-expanding taste for expensive suits and champagne. Meanwhile, back in the quiet suburbs of coastal Virginia, Evelyn was no longer the helpless widow Melissa imagined. Jonathan had filed the paperwork to annul the sale of the beach house. It turned out the buyers had been misled. Melissa had presented herself as having power she didn't truly hold. Jonathan handled it discreetly. Papers exchanged, money refunded, signatures collected. Within weeks, the house was once again Evelyn's. She decided to visit it alone one gray morning. The bus ride to the coast was long, winding past fields and small towns. But when the smell of salt filled the air and the sound of waves drifted through the window, her heart tightened with memory. The beach house stood as it always had, cream-colored paint peeling slightly, the porch sagging under years of weather, yet still beautiful in its stubbornness. Evelyn paused at the gate, her hands trembling as she touched the wooden post Thomas had sanded himself decades ago. Memories rushed back, Melissa at 15, rolling her eyes but secretly delighted when her friends admired the ocean view. Thomas on the porch grill, the smoke curling into the twilight, Christmas mornings with the sound of surf replacing church bells. She whispered softly into the breeze. "We have it back, Thomas. She tried to take it from us, but we have it back." For a long time, Evelyn sat on the porch steps, staring at the endless horizon. It wasn't just a house. It was proof that she still had control, proof that Melissa's betrayal hadn't destroyed her. And more importantly, it was a reminder of Thomas's foresight. He had trusted her to find her strength, even when she didn't know it existed. In Paris, the glitter was beginning to fade. Richard spoke endlessly of business opportunities, vague partnerships with men Melissa never met, plans to invest in ventures that sounded more like fantasies than reality. He dismissed her questions with a laugh. "Relax, babe. You just enjoy the ride. I've got this." But late at night, Melissa lay awake in their expensive hotel room, staring at the ornate ceiling, the guilt gnawing at her. She had left her mother with nothing, or so she believed, stripped her of the house, the truck, the life Thomas had built. She remembered the sharp silence on the other end of the phone when she had hung up. Evelyn hadn't cried, hadn't pleaded. She had simply gone quiet. That silence haunted Melissa more than any shouted argument could have. Richard grew restless. The money, though large at first glance, was bleeding away. Restaurants, jewelry, investments that never materialized. Melissa tried to calculate quietly in her journal, but numbers had never been her strength. "Richard," she said one morning over croissants, "shouldn't we slow down? This money has to last." He leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Don't worry so much. Money flows. You have to spend it to make it. But what if? What if nothing? Trust me, Melissa. I know what I'm doing." Back in Virginia, Evelyn was playing her role carefully. To the neighbors, she remained the grieving widow, walking slowly to the market, nodding with quiet resignation when people asked if she was managing on her own. Margaret Lewis often stopped by with soup or cookies, eyes full of pity. Evelyn accepted them with a smile. Let them believe she was fragile. It only made her secret plans stronger. Every evening, she sat at the kitchen table with Jonathan's updates, studying deeds and bank accounts as though she were cramming for an exam. At first, the financial jargon overwhelmed her, but slowly, the patterns became clear. She realized Thomas hadn't just been lucky. He had been brilliant. Every investment was deliberate, every property chosen for growth. He had built a safety net so wide that Melissa's theft couldn't even dent it. Evelyn began to feel a dangerous thrill. She was no longer just surviving grief. She was outmaneuvering her own daughter. And she didn't need revenge, not yet. What she wanted was patience. She wanted Melissa to believe she had won, to taste the emptiness of her own choices, and only then would Evelyn reveal the truth. One evening, as Evelyn was watering her plants, Margaret leaned over the fence. "I heard from Clara at the post office that Melissa and Richard flew to Paris. Is that true?" Evelyn forced her lips into a weary smile. "Yes, Margaret. They said it was business." "Business?" Margaret frowned. "That man never struck me as the business type." "Neither me," Evelyn said softly, but offered no more. In Paris, Melissa was beginning to see what her mother had seen all along. Richard wasn't a visionary. He was a gambler, reckless and hungry, dragging her along in the wake of his bad decisions. She watched him flirt shamelessly with waitresses, boast about non-existent deals, and spend money as though it were infinite. One night, when she tried to confront him, he snapped. "Don't you dare question me, Melissa. Without me, you're nothing. You'd be rotting in that boring little town with your pathetic mother." The words stung more than she expected. For the first time, Melissa felt a crack in the wall she had built between herself and Evelyn. She thought of her mother sitting alone in that too-quiet house, stripped of the beach home and the truck, and for a fleeting moment, guilt consumed her. But Richard's grip tightened on her arm, pulling her back into the glittering chaos of Paris nightlife. And Melissa, too proud to admit her mistake, let herself be dragged along. Meanwhile, Evelyn was readying her next step. With Jonathan's help, she had secured the annulment of the beach house sale. The truck would be harder, but the house was back under her name. Sitting on the porch, staring out at the ocean, she allowed herself a small smile. Melissa thinks she left me with nothing, Evelyn whispered into the salty breeze. But she has no idea. None. The plan was taking shape. Quiet, patient, unstoppable. Paris in springtime should have been paradise. For Melissa, it turned into a slow-motion nightmare. At first, the novelty distracted her. The cobblestone streets, the glittering Seine, cafes buzzing with chatter. But beneath the romance of Europe, she felt an invisible clock ticking. Every receipt Richard tossed carelessly onto the hotel nightstand was another drop of blood draining from the fortune she had stolen. The beach house, the truck, her father's legacy, all gone for nights of champagne and promises. "Richard," she whispered one morning, staring at the dwindling balance on their joint account. "We need to slow down. The money." He cut her off with a laugh, snapping his gold lighter shut. "You worry too much. Opportunities come to men who think big, not women who fret over pennies." Melissa bit her lip. His dismissiveness no longer charmed her. It grated. Each time he called her babe or waved off her concerns, she saw not a partner but a stranger, a man who had seduced her with dreams and now shackled her with lies. By the third week, creditors began calling their hotel room. Melissa answered once, trembling as a French voice demanded payment for a business loan Richard had apparently signed. She confronted him in the lobby, but Richard only sneered. "Don't look at me like that. Every investment carries risk. You wanted a life better than sitting in your mom's dusty old kitchen, didn't you? Well, this is the price." That night, he didn't come back to the hotel until dawn. His shirt smelled of perfume that wasn't hers. Back in Virginia, Evelyn Carter folded laundry in the quiet hum of her modest home. To outsiders, nothing had changed. She still walked to the market, still attended church on Sundays, still watered her begonias while neighbors clucked their tongues about poor Evelyn left behind. But inside her dresser drawer lay the manila envelope that had transformed her world. Every evening, she spread its contents across the table. Deeds, bank statements, the letter Thomas had written with such calm foresight. Jonathan Miller called twice a week with updates. "The beach house is officially back in your name," he reported one Tuesday. "As for the truck, it's trickier. Melissa used a power of attorney you signed after Thomas's death. We may need to prove deception." Evelyn listened, her voice steady. "Do what you must, quietly." She didn't want noise. She didn't want spectacle. What she wanted was patience. The patience of a mother who would let her daughter learn the weight of betrayal the hard way. In the evenings, as she sipped tea by the window, Evelyn imagined Melissa in Europe, surrounded by glitter and lies. Did her daughter ever think of her? Did she picture her mother eating soup alone, counting coins to pay the electric bill? Evelyn smiled at the irony. If only Melissa knew that her poor widow mother controlled more wealth than she and Richard could squander in a lifetime. But the time for revelation had not yet come. First, Melissa had to fall. Paris gave Melissa her breaking point on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She returned from shopping groceries, bread and fruit, because their account balance no longer allowed for lavish meals, to find the hotel manager waiting outside their suite. "Madame," he said coldly, "your husband has not paid the last week. If the bill is not settled by tonight, you must leave." Melissa's hands shook. "That's impossible. We paid." The manager handed her a ledger with neat French handwriting. No payments, no excuses, just debt. When Richard stumbled in hours later, drunk and smug, Melissa exploded. "You lied to me. We're broke. They're throwing us out." Richard laughed, collapsing onto the bed. "Relax, I've got options." "Options? Like what? Another lie? Another woman?" The laughter froze on his face. He sat up slowly, eyes narrowing. "Careful, Melissa. You need me. Without me, you're nothing." And in that instant, she saw the truth. He was right about one thing. She had given him everything. Her loyalty, her mother's house, her father's memory. She had nothing left but shame. That night, while Richard snored, Melissa cried silently into the hotel pillow, her tears mingling with guilt so heavy it felt like chains around her chest. She remembered the sound of her mother's voice during their last call. Not anger, not pleading, just silence. Cold, unshakable silence. Evelyn had known. Somehow, she had always known. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Evelyn's performance was flawless. Margaret Lewis stopped by with a casserole, clucking sympathetically. "It must be so hard, Evelyn, with Melissa gone and Richard dragging her into who knows what. You're left here all alone." Evelyn forced a weary smile. "We do what we can, Margaret, one day at a time." Inside, she almost laughed. If Margaret knew the truth, that Evelyn was orchestrating legal moves like a general preparing for battle, she would have dropped the casserole right on the floor. That night, Jonathan called again. "Mrs. Carter, I've confirmed Richard Hayes is drowning in debt. He's leveraged loans under false pretenses. Banks are circling. It's only a matter of time before Melissa realizes she's tied to a sinking ship." Evelyn set her teacup down, eyes glinting in the dim light. "Good. Let the tide carry them further out. Only then will she swim back." By summer's edge, Melissa's life in Paris had collapsed. Richard disappeared one morning, leaving only a note. "Don't wait for me. I'll find a way. You'll be fine." There was no return address, no apology, just abandonment. Melissa sat alone in the hotel lobby with 2 suitcases, the last of her mother's stolen money gone, her credit cards declined, and her pride shattered. She stared at the Parisian crowds rushing by, realizing she was utterly, devastatingly alone. For the first time, she longed not for Richard, not for wealth, but for the quiet of her mother's kitchen, for the smell of coffee brewing in the mornings, for the safety of a home built not on money but on love. She whispered into the din of foreign voices, "Mom, what have I done?" Back in Virginia, Evelyn felt the shift before she heard it. She knew Melissa would come back. Betrayal has a way of leading people home, but home would not be the same. Evelyn would not greet her daughter with open arms of blind forgiveness. Not yet. She would greet her with something far stronger, truth. The stage was set. The daughter had fallen. The mother was ready. Melissa Carter returned to America on a humid July afternoon, stepping off the plane at Dulles International with only one battered suitcase and the same wrinkled blazer she had worn for 3 days straight. Richard was gone, vanished into Europe with a woman half her age and twice as naive. The last words he had left her were scribbled on a hotel napkin. "Don't wait for me." At the arrivals gate, no one waited. No chauffeur, no friend, no husband. She stood alone, scanning the crowd, until she admitted the truth. She had no one left but her mother. Melissa took a cab straight to her old apartment building in downtown Richmond, the one she had once bragged about as her place. She rolled her suitcase up to the glass doors only to be met by the doorman, whose face carried both pity and unease. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter," he said softly. "You'll need to speak with the superintendent." Confused, Melissa argued her way inside, only to find an envelope taped to her apartment door. The bold legal letters screamed louder than any voice could. Notice of eviction. 30 days to vacate. The property had a new legal owner. Melissa stumbled inside, clutching the paper. The walls echoed with emptiness. Richard's cologne was gone. Their furniture had been repossessed. The life she thought she owned had evaporated overnight. Her phone buzzed. Unknown caller. She answered with trembling hands. "Miss Carter?" The voice was formal, measured. "This is Jonathan Miller, your late father's attorney. We need to meet, urgently." That same morning, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, calm as the sea before a storm. She had instructed Jonathan to deliver the eviction notice exactly as planned, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Melissa had to feel the ground shatter beneath her before she could rebuild on solid rock. Aurora, her lifelong neighbor, poked her head through the open door. "Evelyn, I saw Melissa last night. She's back. Poor thing looked like she'd been through hell." Evelyn folded her hands. "Yes, Aurora, hell has a way of teaching lessons heaven never could." The following day, Melissa walked into Jonathan's office looking like a ghost of herself. Her designer heels were scuffed, her hair unkempt, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. She clutched the eviction notice in her hand like a death warrant. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice breaking, "there's been some mistake. This apartment is mine. It's all I have left." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Evelyn, who sat silently in the corner, her gray dress as modest as ever, her expression unreadable. "Miss Carter," Jonathan said gently, "there's no mistake. This property, along with several others, has always been under the ownership of a company your father established, Robert Investments, Inc. You were a tenant, not the owner. The recent sale of the beach house was fraudulent. The truck as well. You had no legal right to sell them." Melissa's face drained of color. "What are you saying? None of it was mine?" Jonathan slid a thick folder across the table. "Your father was a careful man. He left his wife as the sole heir of all holdings. That means everything belongs to your mother, Mrs. Evelyn Carter." Melissa's gaze snapped to Evelyn, who hadn't moved. Her mother's eyes, calm and sharp, met hers with a silence more cutting than any scolding. "You knew?" Melissa whispered. "All this time, while I thought you were broke." Evelyn's voice, steady and cold, finally filled the room. "Yes, Melissa, I knew." "Then why?" Melissa's voice cracked, tears streaming. "Why let me drown? Why watch me crawl back here with nothing when you could have stopped it?" Evelyn leaned forward, her hands clasped like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "Because you needed to understand what money cannot teach. You needed to lose everything to see what truly matters." Melissa sobbed, clutching the folder. "Mom, you sold memories for pocket change." Evelyn cut in, her voice rising for the first time. "The beach house where your father built our summers. The truck he polished every Sunday like it was family. You discarded me with a phone call. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" The room fell silent except for Melissa's muffled cries. Outside, the Virginia sun beat down on the courthouse square. Melissa sat on the steps, her body trembling. Evelyn stood beside her, unyielding. "Mom," Melissa said hoarsely, "I have nothing. Richard's gone. The debts. You have 30 days, Evelyn interrupted. 30 days to decide who you want to be. You can beg, lie, and cling to what's gone, or you can rebuild. But this time, Melissa, you'll rebuild the hard way." Melissa looked up, broken and desperate. "Will you help me?" Evelyn's eyes softened for just a moment, a flicker of the mother who had once tucked her in at night. "I will give you a roof and food. But the rest, you'll earn. Respect, trust, dignity. Those are not gifts. They are choices." Melissa nodded slowly, tears cutting lines down her cheeks. For the first time, she wasn't the entitled daughter or the reckless wife. She was simply a woman stripped bare of illusions, staring at the long climb ahead. And Evelyn, watching her, knew the lesson had finally begun. The eviction notice had done its work. Melissa no longer saw herself as the wealthy daughter of Thomas Carter, nor as the glamorous wife of Richard Hayes. She was simply Melissa, broke, jobless, and clinging to the mercy of the woman she had once betrayed. Evelyn allowed her to stay, but the rules were clear. No entitlement, no excuses. "This is my house," she said one evening over a dinner of roast chicken and potatoes. "You contribute or you leave. That's the only bargain." Melissa nodded silently. She had no bargaining chips left. The next morning, Melissa rose early and dressed in a plain blouse borrowed from her mother's closet. Gone were the designer heels and silk dresses she had flaunted in Paris. She walked into town, resume in hand, knocking on doors she would have once passed without a glance. At the grocery store, the manager looked her up and down skeptically. "You ever worked stock before?" Melissa hesitated. "No, sir, but I can learn." The man shook his head. "We need people with experience. Try the diner down the street." At the diner, she filled out an application while Evelyn sat outside in the truck, pretending to read a newspaper but watching through the window. Melissa's hands shook as she wrote her name, her pride dissolving with every stroke of the pen. The manager, a woman with tired eyes and a stained apron, glanced at the application. "We need a night waitress. The pay's lousy, the hours worse." "Still want it?" Melissa swallowed. "Yes." And just like that, the daughter who once measured worth by the cut of her clothes became a waitress at Darla's diner, working graveyard shifts for minimum wage. The first week nearly broke her. Her feet blistered, her back ached, and customers treated her like furniture. She spilled coffee on a trucker's lap, got cursed at by a drunk college kid, and cried in the restroom during her 10-minute break. But every night, when she dragged herself back into her mother's house at dawn, Evelyn was waiting with coffee. She never asked, "How was work?" She simply slid the mug across the table and said, "Drink. You'll need it." Melissa's hands shook as she lifted the cup. She wanted to thank her mother, but the words stuck. Gratitude felt foreign on her tongue. Jonathan Miller called Evelyn one afternoon. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "we've gathered evidence. Richard falsified Melissa's signature on several loans. Legally, she can walk away from the debts. We can clear her name within weeks." Evelyn's voice was calm. "Not yet. Let her carry the weight a little longer. She needs to know how heavy it feels before she learns it doesn't belong to her." Jonathan hesitated. "You're certain?" "I'm her mother," Evelyn replied, "and I'm certain." At the diner, Melissa was learning lessons Evelyn couldn't have taught with words. She watched coworkers, single mothers, retirees, immigrants, grind through double shifts without complaint. She listened to their stories on smoke breaks, debts, sick children, marriages that had fallen apart. One woman, Gloria, laughed as she flicked ash from her cigarette. "There are two kinds of people here, honey. The ones who never had a chance and the ones who threw their chance away. Which one are you?" Melissa's throat tightened. "The second one." Gloria smiled sadly. "Then you better learn faster than the rest of us." That night, Melissa cried into her pillow, not from exhaustion, but from clarity. For the first time, she admitted the truth. She had wasted the life her parents built for her. Evelyn saw the change. Slowly, Melissa stopped complaining. She woke up earlier, cooked dinner on her days off, even fixed the squeaky porch door Thomas had once cursed at. One evening, as the cicadas hummed outside, Melissa brought her mother a plate of pie from the diner. "It's not much," she said, "but I wanted you to have it." Evelyn tasted the pie and nodded. "Too sweet." Melissa laughed, a sound Evelyn hadn't heard in months. For a moment, it was almost like old times. 3 weeks later, Jonathan delivered the final news. "Mrs. Carter, the case is airtight. Melissa is free of Richard's debts. All we need is your signature to finalize it." Evelyn looked out the window at her daughter, bent over in the garden pulling weeds. Her blouse was stained, her hair tied messily, but there was dignity in her movements, an honesty Evelyn hadn't seen since Melissa was a girl. "Hold the papers," Evelyn told Jonathan. "Not yet." She needed to see one more thing. Not just that Melissa could work, but that she could change. The test came sooner than expected. A regular at the diner, a wealthy businessman, left Melissa a $200 tip one night. Her coworkers whistled, jealous. Melissa stared at the money in her hand, her mind flashing back to Paris, to nights of easy cash and careless spending. She folded the bills neatly and handed them to Gloria. "Your son needs new shoes, right? Take it." Gloria's mouth fell open. "Melissa, are you crazy?" Melissa shook her head. "No, I'm finally not." When Evelyn heard the story later from Gloria herself, she said nothing. She simply turned to the window where Melissa was folding laundry and whispered to the night, "Thomas, our daughter is learning." Summer bled into autumn, painting Virginia in gold and crimson. Melissa was still working nights at the diner, her hair pulled into a bun, her hands calloused from carrying trays. Evelyn watched quietly, measuring each day, each choice. Then one morning, Jonathan Miller arrived at the Carter home with a thick folder. He placed it on the kitchen table, his expression serious but triumphant. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "everything is finalized. The debts are cleared, the property's secured. Richard Hayes has been arrested in Paris on charges of fraud. Your daughter's name is clean." Melissa, standing in the doorway, froze. "What did you say?" Jonathan glanced at Evelyn. Evelyn nodded. "Melissa," Jonathan explained gently, "you were never legally responsible for Richard's loans. He forged your signature. With the evidence we gathered, the court has absolved you of all liability. You're free." Melissa's breath hitched. She sank into a chair, her face pale. "Free? After everything? After all those nights wondering how I'd pay? After losing everything?" Evelyn's voice was steady. "You needed to believe you carried that weight, Melissa. Otherwise, You never would have learned how heavy it really was. Melissa turned to her mother, eyes wide, tears threatening. You knew? All this time, you knew? Evelyn nodded. Yes, and I chose not to tell you, not until I saw you change. Melissa buried her face in her hands. Mom, I hated you. I thought you were weak, poor, helpless. I left you with nothing. And all along, I was never weak, Evelyn interrupted. I was waiting for you to become strong. That evening, mother and daughter sat on the porch, the same place where Thomas had once smoked his pipe and watched the waves roll in. The silence between them was different now. Not cold, not accusing, but heavy with truth. Melissa finally spoke. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Evelyn sipped her tea. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, it's about choosing. I chose to forgive you the moment you walked back through my door, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You had to face them, and you did. Melissa wiped her tears, her voice trembling. I don't want to waste this second chance. I want to earn it. Evelyn studied her daughter's face. The hollow arrogance was gone, replaced by humility, scars, and something like dignity. Then start here, Evelyn said softly. Not with money, with respect, with responsibility, with love. Melissa nodded. I will, Mom. I swear it. 2 weeks later, Evelyn drove Melissa back to the beach house. The autumn sun glittered on the waves, and gulls cried overhead. Melissa stood on the porch, touching the railing her father had built, her eyes filling with tears. I sold this place for nothing, she whispered. I reduced 40 years of memories to a price tag. And now, Evelyn said gently, you'll help me turn it into something more. Melissa looked at her, puzzled. What do you mean? I've decided, Evelyn explained, to open this house as a shelter for women who've been abandoned, abused, or left behind. Women like you were, women like me might have been. We'll call it Thomas House. Your father would have wanted that. Melissa's lips trembled. A shelter? Here? Yes. With the resources your father left and with your new strength, we can give others a place to rebuild. Not a handout, a hand up. You understand the difference now. Melissa threw her arms around her mother, sobbing. Thank you, Mom. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you. Evelyn held her close, her own tears falling freely. I never stopped believing, Melissa. I only waited for you to believe in yourself. By winter, Thomas House opened its doors. Evelyn managed the finances. Melissa handled day-to-day operations. Women arrived with nothing but bruises and broken dreams, and found not just shelter but guidance. One evening, as they prepared dinner for the residents, Melissa paused, looking at her mother across the kitchen. You know, she said, Richard taught me lies, but you taught me truth, painful, brutal truth, and it saved me. Evelyn smiled faintly. Truth is love, Melissa, not the soft kind that comforts, but the kind that makes you grow. Melissa placed a pot on the stove, her eyes shining. Then I'll spend the rest of my life passing it on. And for the first time since Thomas's death, Evelyn felt peace. Their family had been shattered, betrayed, and tested, but in the ashes, something stronger had risen. Not just wealth, not just survival, but a bond forged in truth, dignity, and love. The storm had passed, and the Carters, mother and daughter, stood together in its calm. Winter's chill settled over Virginia, but inside the beach house, now proudly bearing a new sign that read Thomas House, warmth pulsed through every corner. Melissa was no longer a guest in her mother's home. She was a leader, a caretaker, a woman reborn. The first residents had arrived just before Christmas. A mother of two escaping a violent husband, a teenage girl whose relatives had discarded her, and an older woman who had lost everything to medical bills. Melissa greeted them not with pity, but with the empathy of someone who had once been broken herself. Evelyn watched quietly from the porch as Melissa showed the women their rooms. She saw patience in her daughter's gestures, strength in her voice, and humility in her smile. This was not the same Melissa who had sold her father's truck for a plane ticket to Paris. This was someone new, someone Thomas would have been proud of. One afternoon, as Evelyn sorted through papers in the kitchen, Jonathan Miller arrived with a letter. He set it on the table, his expression uneasy. It's from Richard Hayes, he said. Melissa froze when she saw the handwriting. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a desperate scrawl from a Parisian prison. "Melissa, I've made mistakes. I need you. I have nothing. Please forgive me. Please send money. I can't survive here without you." Melissa read it twice, then handed it silently to her mother. Evelyn said nothing, only waited. Finally, Melissa exhaled. "I used to believe his lies. I sold my soul for them. But now I see him for what he is, a man who takes until there's nothing left. He'll never change." She crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fire. The flames devoured it in seconds. "That chapter is over," she said firmly. Evelyn's lips curved in the faintest smile. Her daughter had finally severed the last chain. Weeks passed. Melissa kept working at the diner part-time, but her real energy went into Thomas' house. She organized donation drives, scheduled volunteers, and even enrolled in community college courses in social work. At night, she studied by the lamplight while Evelyn quilted beside her. "Mom," she said one evening, "I used to think money was power, but it's not. Power is knowing who you are, even when you have nothing. That's what you taught me." Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "And you taught me something too, Melissa, that even the lost can be found again." By spring, Thomas House had become a refuge not just for its residents, but for the entire community. Neighbors who once gossiped about Evelyn's tragic life now donated furniture and groceries. Margaret Lewis volunteered twice a week teaching cooking classes. Aurora planted a vegetable garden in the yard. And Melissa, once the prodigal daughter, stood at the center of it all, respected and admired. One evening, after the residents had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Evelyn and Melissa sat together on the porch. The ocean spread endlessly before them, the waves whispering like an old friend. Melissa leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "Do you think Dad knows? Do you think he sees what we've built?" Evelyn gazed at the horizon, her eyes glistening. "I know he does. He's in every brick of this house, every laugh we share, every tear we've shed. He left us more than money, Melissa. He left us a chance to become who we were meant to be." For a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the waves. Finally, Evelyn whispered into the wind, "Thomas, we did it. Our daughter has come home." 5 years later, the beach house no longer stood as a fragile memory of the past. It had become something bigger, something alive. Thomas House was now a sanctuary known across the county, a place where women came to start again. Melissa Carter, no longer the lost daughter of Evelyn, walked its halls with the quiet confidence of a woman who had rebuilt herself from ashes. She had earned her degree in social work, balancing classes with endless hours of volunteering, and now carried the title of program director. The women she once served as peers now looked at her as a guide. One spring afternoon, Melissa stood on the porch with a clipboard, watching children play in the yard. Their laughter rose above the waves, mingling with the cries of gulls. She smiled, not the forced smile she once wore in Paris, but a genuine one, rooted in pride and purpose. Inside, Evelyn watched her daughter through the window. Age had slowed her steps, silvering her hair, but her heart was lighter than it had ever been. She remembered the phone call years ago, the one where Melissa had coldly said, "We sold your beach house. We needed the money." Now that same daughter was fighting to preserve the house not as property, but as hope. Jonathan Miller stopped by with papers for the foundation's expansion. "Mrs. Carter," he said with his usual formality, "your daughter is doing remarkable work. We've secured funding for a second shelter downtown." Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's not my daughter anymore, Jonathan. It's our daughter, Thomas's and mine. He raised her once. Now she's raising others." That evening, Melissa and Evelyn sat together on the porch, just as they had so many times before. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow across the ocean. "Mom," Melissa said softly, "I've been offered a position with the State Social Services Department. They want me to oversee programs across Virginia. I'd have to leave the day-to-day here to a new manager, but I think it's the next step." Evelyn smiled. "And what does your heart say?" Melissa looked at the house, the garden, the women bustling in the kitchen. My heart says this house gave me back my life, but maybe now it's time to help others find theirs on a larger scale. Evelyn reached over, taking her daughter's hand. Then go. Thomas House will always be here, and so will I, but the world needs the woman you've become. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. I couldn't have done it without you. No, Evelyn corrected gently. You couldn't have done it without yourself. I just refused to give up on you until you remembered who you were. Later that night, after Melissa had gone inside, Evelyn stayed on the porch alone. The stars glittered above the ocean, as they had on countless nights when Thomas was alive. She tilted her face to the sky and whispered, Thomas, we kept our promise. She fell, yes, but she rose higher than either of us dreamed. She carries your name, your legacy in every life she touches. And when I'm gone, she'll carry mine too. The waves answered with their eternal rhythm, and Evelyn felt peace wash over her. The story that had begun with betrayal and loss had ended with redemption and love, not the soft, fragile kind, but the fierce kind that rebuilds empires out of ruins. Inside, Melissa tucked a blanket around her mother, smiling softly. Come to bed, Mom. Tomorrow we have work to do. Evelyn rose, leaning on her daughter's arm. Together, they walked into the house that was no longer just theirs. It belonged to every woman who had ever needed a second chance. And in that truth, Evelyn finally felt Thomas's presence not as a memory, but as a certainty. The legacy was complete. The spring air carried a crisp sweetness as Melissa stepped into the state capitol building in Richmond. 5 years ago, she had walked into diners begging for minimum wage jobs. Now she walked into marble halls where lawmakers debated budgets and policies. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing a rhythm of quiet confidence. Director Carter, one of the aides, greeted her. The committee is waiting. Director. The title still felt strange, but Melissa carried it with pride. She was no longer just Evelyn's daughter, no longer the woman Richard had broken. She was the architect of programs that stretched across Virginia, shelters, training centers, food networks, all built on the blueprint of a single house by the sea. Back in the coastal town, Evelyn sat on the porch of Thomas House, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. Age had bent her frame, but not her spirit. She watched as volunteers arrived, young women who had once been residents, now returning to give back. One of them, Clara, approached with a smile. Mrs. Carter, I got the job as site manager for the new shelter downtown. I never thought I'd make it this far. Thank you. Evelyn's eyes glistened. Don't thank me, child. Thank yourself. You chose to rise. Clara shook her head. I chose to rise because you showed me it was possible. As Clara hurried off, Evelyn whispered to herself, the circle continues. That evening, Melissa returned home after a long day of hearings. She found her mother sitting by the fire, the same steady glow that had lit their darkest nights. Mom, she said softly, they approved the expansion plan. In 2 years, we'll have Thomas houses in every major city in Virginia. Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes heavy with both pride and fatigue. Your father would be proud. You've carried his name further than I ever dreamed. Melissa knelt beside her, taking her frail hands. I didn't just carry his name, Mom. I carried yours too. Every choice I make, every program I design, I hear your voice reminding me of consequences, of truth, of love. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. Then my work is done. Later that night, as the waves rolled against the shore, Melissa stood alone on the porch. She looked out at the horizon, remembering the girl she once was, reckless, entitled, lost. That girl had died in Paris, and from her ashes, this woman had risen. She whispered into the sea breeze, Dad, Mom, I'll keep building. Not for money, not for pride, but for the lives that still need saving. And with that vow, the legacy of the Carters stretched into the future, not as wealth locked in vaults, but as compassion written into the lives of those who once had nothing. The story had begun with betrayal. It ended with a promise kept. Life has a way of circling back, of turning pain into wisdom and betrayal into strength. For Evelyn Carter, what began as loss became legacy. For Melissa, what began as arrogance became humility. Together, they proved that family is not defined by the mistakes we make, but by the courage to rise after we fall. Thomas House stood as the clearest proof of that truth. Once a simple beach home nearly sold for scraps, it had grown into a beacon for the broken. A place where second chances were not just offered, but built brick by brick. Every woman who crossed its threshold carried the echo of the Carter story, that you can lose everything, money, pride, love, and still find yourself again. Evelyn, in her twilight years, finally knew peace. She had kept her promise to Thomas. She had protected their daughter, not by shielding her from pain, but by allowing pain to teach her. And Melissa, reborn from ashes, carried her parents' legacy further than either of them could have dreamed. On a quiet evening, mother and daughter stood on the porch together, the Atlantic stretching endlessly before them. The waves rolled in and out, steady, eternal, as if whispering that life too was a tide, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, but always moving forward. Evelyn slipped her hand into Melissa's. No words were needed. They had walked through betrayal, through emptiness, through fire, and emerged not broken, but whole. Somewhere in the rhythm of the sea, in the laughter of children playing at Thomas House, in the steady heartbeat of redemption, the presence of Thomas Carter lingered still. And so the story closed, not with loss, but with legacy, not with silence, but with love.